Hey YouTube. So, for those of you who haven't read Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail, or even if you have read it and just haven't read it recently, I would really recommend taking a look at it again or for the first time, because I think it is probably one of the most brilliant, if not the most brilliant, kind of writing on identity politics that I've really ever seen. And I think that that is true kind of regardless of sort of what group you're talking about. I know that this was written in the context of U.S. civil rights, but I think it applies in a lot of ways similarly to the feminist movement, the trans movement, the gay rights movements, really kind of any minority group that is looking for tolerance, acceptance, equality. Because in his letter, he says a lot of stuff about privilege, exclusion versus inclusion, when something actually impacts somebody else. So, for example, he says, whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Never can we afford to live with the narrow, provincial, outside agitator idea. Anybody who lives inside the United States can never be considered an outsider within its bounds. And so when you combine that with things like calling out privileged people for rarely, if ever, giving up their privilege, and also saying things like, so the question is not whether we will be extremists, but what kind of extremists we will be. Will we be extremists for hate or for love? Will we be extremists for the preservation of injustice or for the extension of justice? I think you can see that this is basically the handbook for people who are talking about identity politics, because essentially all these arguments come down to is exclusion versus inclusion, in that people will make a lot of arguments against particular things. So in this case, against trans rights, because, well, look at how much women already deal with in the world, or maybe the gay right movement is bigger, better, maybe timed more appropriately, so we shouldn't bog down and end up with trans language or something like that. Basically, if you take that in the context of MLK's letter here, he's saying that, there's not a proper time to wait for the argument for trans rights. That people who already have more privilege than trans people aren't going to voluntarily give that up. So somebody who might be able to get a vote on something for lesbians and gays, or women in the workplace, or whatever, might be reluctant to then include trans women at the risk of giving that up, or basically lots of interpretations. And then essentially, are you going to be on the side of hate? So are you going to be like these fundamentalists, these people who hate trans people, or are you going to say that, yes, we are all equal, we're all human beings, and we all deserve the same rights, the same opportunities that everybody else gets? And are we going to allow the legal system to keep this up, or are we going to not? And I think that to some extent you can almost argue that, obviously that there are sort of extremists who are very gung-ho about preserving inequality, but that people who aren't interested in even the fight for equality, if you're not with us, you're against us. And I know people will say, well, that's kind of extremist, like they're not actively part of the problem. But even Martin Luther King Jr. said, to paraphrase, because I don't have the quote in front of me, but that all that evil needs to triumph is the indifference of good men. And so, like all transphobia, all sort of exclusionary politics need to survive is for people in the mainstream to not be concerned with it, because it doesn't affect them, even though to an extent it does. Because if people are willing to legislate against me, not include me in the political process at some point they might feel the same way about you. And is that really kind of the democracy, the kind of country, the kind of world that you want to live in? And I think that if you even just look to our most recent election here, you can see that this is already really taking place in the United States, where you have the 1%, the 99%, the 47% versus, the makers versus the takers. You have all of this us versus them. You have these exclusions because people have figured out and have known forever that all you need to do is get 51% of people to be an us. And so you try to include them however you can so that you can exclude them as easily as possible. And that's what all this politics boils down to. And so that's why I think that exclusionary politics, whatever kind of the basis is, are bad for this country. And I think that, even 50 years after his death, we still can't get something that seems really quite so simple down into the books.